This is Samsung. In this video we are looking at trade, exploration and colonization. So first of all we need to look at the changing attitudes under Elizabeth I towards these things. As by the mid-16th century, Portugal and Spain had well established patterns of trade and colonization in America and the East, and this contrasted to England's discoveries which were limited to Newfoundland and the cod fisheries. Now Henry VIII had shown some interest in creating a navy, yet he was still obsessed with gaining conquest in France rather than the prosperity which lay further afield. Now Elizabeth started the process of creating an empire centered on international trade. Now although Flanders would remain important for trade, further international trade would offer opportunity when conflicts within Europe broke out. By 1600, England started to become known as a seafaring nation that was developing trade around the world. So they had also managed to challenge the claim of the Portuguese and the Spanish that all newly discovered lands were automatically theirs, and this was confirmed in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was an agreement between Spain and Portugal aiming at settling land newly discovered or explored by Christopher Columbus or other 15th century explorers. But many English explorers were convinced that they could find a new route to the Far East via the northeast or the northwest passage, and whilst these were doomed to fail, they created a number of new developments. So if you first look at the northeast passage, as in 1553, at the start of Mary I's reign, Sir Hugh Willoughby and Richard Chancellor had sailed northeast and found their route blockaded by ice. However, a profitable trade with Russia was started with the creation of the Muscovy Company. So this left both the Tsar Ivan IV and Richard Chancellor optimistic about the trading future. It gave the English a good market for English wool in exchange for Russian fur, and it meant that Muscovy became less isolated. So the Muscovy Company was chartered in 1555 by Mary I, and Chancellor and Willoughby launched a second voyage in the same year. So Chancellor secured a number of trade privileges within Russia for the company, including control of English passage and freedom from arrest. However, on the way back, both Willoughby and Chancellor were killed. Then Anthony Jenkinson was the person who succeeded Chancellor as the main trader of the Muscovy Company, and he made a number of explorations to Russia, and from 1562 to 1579 he attempted to explore southern Russia into Persia and explore new trading links there. So it meant that the Muscovy Company was able to break the monopoly of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic, which had had this monopoly for a very long time. Now if we look at the Northwest Passage, as Martin Frobisher joined forces with Sir Christopher Hatton and John Dee in an attempt to discover the Northwest Passage that would lead him to Cathay in China. Now he was able to persuade the Muscovy Company to allow him to launch an expedition in 1576. So this meant that he set off in June 1576 before further expeditions took place in 1577 and 1578. Now in these expeditions, Frobisher was able to find what he named as the Frobisher Strait by Canada, and his belief though that he could find a route to China from here was evidently wrong. But during Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, which we'll look at later, he sailed up the west coast of North America to try and find a route to China, yet he too failed. And then John Davis, after receiving funding from Francis Walsingham, launched the first of 3 voyages in 1585. And although he found nothing of commercial value, he made a valuable contribution to the mapping of the Arctic. Now he established that Greenland was separate from America and also sailed in Baffin's Bay. So now we have to look at John Hawkins and the beginnings of the slave trade. John Hawkins was a constant menace to the Spanish and Portuguese monopolies, as we saw in a video about Elizabeth I's foreign policy. Now he made successful voyages to Africa throughout the 1560s, and he opened up trade with slaves. So in 1562, Hawkins sailed with 3 ships towards the Caribbean via Sierra Leone, and they hijacked a Portuguese slave ship and traded the 301 slaves in the Caribbean islands. He traded the slaves in Santo Domingo, which is a West Indian island, and he made profits for his London investors. So the profits in his first expedition meant that the expedition was repeated, and this was funded by a group of shareholders including William Cecil, the Earl of Leicester and the Queen herself. So along with Francis Drake, he sailed to the West African coast and he carried 400 African slaves to Borborata on the Venezuelan coasts, and Hawkins returned to England having made a 60% profit for the financiers. Hawkins' third voyage took place in 1567 with Francis Drake, and they managed to obtain male slaves from Africa and captured the Portuguese slave ship Madre de Dios and its human cargo. So this meant that he took about 400 slaves across the Atlantic to sell in Santo Domingo, Margarita Island and Borborata. However, at San Juan de Ulùa, they encountered a strong Spanish force and the Spanish destroyed all but 2 of the ships in the Battle of San Juan de Ulùa. Next, we need to look at Francis Drake and his exploration and then the circumnavigation of the world. As in 1572, Drake embarked upon his first independent voyage, and he planned an attack on the Spanish Main, which was Panama, where he would capture Nombre de Dios, and therefore Spanish silver. Now this was because Spain picked up their silver from the town of Nombre de Dios. So in March 1573, Drake was able to capture the Spanish silver train at Nombre de Dios, and he came back to England being considered a hero. In Spain though, they viewed him as a pirate, and he was known to them as El Drac. At the end of 1577, Drake set off with a fleet of 5 ships. He sailed down the coast of Africa, taking any foreign vessels that came in his way, and then he sailed across the Atlantic to the New World before passing through the Strait of Magellan and entering the Pacific. So Drake's expedition was of much embarrassment to the Spanish, especially when Drake captured the Cacafuego near Lima in 1579, and its cargo, which was worth 25,000 pesos of Peruvian gold. So Drake returned to England in 1580 as only the second person to circumnavigate the world. He had made profits of 4,000%, and this led to his subsequent knighthood in 1581. But by the end of Elizabeth's reign, expedition had stalled slightly because Elizabeth was forced to concentrate on defence and the events in Europe, such as things like the Spanish Armada. However, the pattern of confident English privateers had been established during Elizabeth I's reign. Next, we just need to look at colonisation, as the Spanish and Portuguese had evidently succeeded in creating successful colonies, and this had piqued the interest of the English. So the idea that England should start colonising North America originated from the entrepreneur and explorer Humphrey Gilbert. And financed from the Cathay Company, he sailed in 1578 to the northwest of Africa to try and set up a colony. So it was unsuccessful, as was another expedition to Newfoundland in 1583. But the process of colonisation was encouraged again in 1584 when Richard Hakluyt published a discourse in Western planting. And Walter Raleigh presented the discourse to the Queen, and he gained the support of a number of private investors, including Francis Walsingham. So in 1585, Raleigh received a patent from the Queen to colonise what became known as Virginia. So 2 expeditions landed on Roanoke Island as to what was become North Carolina. However, unfortunately for Raleigh's investors and those who died in the attempts at colonisation proved disastrous. So this was from a combination of poor organisation, ill luck, and reluctance from the Queen to give the matter full priority at a time of war with Spain. So with focus firmly on Europe after the Spanish Armada, Raleigh's only other trip was in 1595 up to Orinoco in Guinea in search of the El Dorado. Now, colonisation then was only truly able to start in the reign of James I of England. Next, we need to look at trade, and the 4 points relating to English trade can be made with relative certainty. So firstly, the value of internal trade did exceed that of external trade. So the biggest developments occurred in the growth of shipping coal from the Tyne to the Thames to meet the growing demands of the London market. So some coal was exported across the North Sea into France though. Then there was also a wider range of foreign luxury goods which were imported throughout Elizabeth's reign, and this meant that such goods became more affordable within England. The cloth trade with the Netherlands, whilst remaining important, did decline relatively as part of the economy, and this was because the Antwerp cloth market had declined. For political reasons, Cecil wanted to develop trade with other areas to end dependence on a single market, and this meant that trade was developed with the German port of Emden, and more trade was completed with Amsterdam at the expense of Antwerp, which was under Spanish control. There were attempts also to expand trade overseas, yet these did remain marginal. So in the 1580s, the two major changes in English trading patterns were the main markets for English wool moved from the southern Netherlands to the north, and there was an increase in trade with the Ottoman Empire. A number of trading companies were also set up with varying degrees of success to widen England's trading interests. So the first one, which we've already talked about, is the Muscovy Company, and this had been set up in 1555 to trade with Russia and Northern Europe, although it failed in the long term to compete effectively with the Dutch. Then the Eastland Company was founded in 1579 in order to foster trade with Scandinavia and the Baltic Sea states. So they were used in order to challenge the monopoly of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic states, yet they did have limited success. Then there was the Levant Company, and the Levant Company was an English chartered company founded in 1581, and this enjoyed success in developing trade with the Ottoman Empire. And then finally there was the East India Company, and certain sailors thought that trade could be developed with India because they were weakly defended by the Portuguese. So attempts were launched in 1583 under Newbury and Fitch, and in 1591 under James Lancaster. Now this was a prelude to the creation of the East India Company in 1600. Now in the first 15 years of their creation, they were granted a monopoly of English trade with all countries east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. Now the East India Company had less investment than the Dutch East India Company though, and this meant that they did find it very difficult to compete in the short term. However, obviously later in history they become very big. Now, with the exception of the Eastland Company, all of these companies were joint stock companies, which meant that they were owned by shareholders. Now, this would prove essential for future capitalist development. So thank you for watching this video, and see you soon. Bye.